At 03:17 hours on the morning of April 4th, 1943, Major William Edwin Dyess pressed his body flat against the red Philippine mud and listened to the jungle breathe. He had been listening for 11 months. 11 months of barbed wire and bamboo stakes, of rice that smelled of mildew, of guards who communicated primarily through the butt of a rifle. He was 27 years old, a pilot, a squadron commander, a man who 14 months earlier had been one of the most aggressive fighter pilots in the entire United States Army Air Forces. The kind of officer who flew his P-40 Warhawk so close to the ground during strafing runs that mechanics could find grass stains on his landing gear. Now he was belly down in the Mindanao muck, counting the heartbeats between Japanese sentry rotations. 9 other men were with him. 3 of them were Navy. 2 were Army Air Forces. 4 were soldiers who had survived Bataan, survived the Death March, survived Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan, which is to say, they had survived things that most men simply did not survive. Between them they carried 2 pistols, a handful of dried fish wrapped in a palm leaf, and a hand-drawn map that may or may not have been accurate. The Philippine guerrilla contact who was supposed to meet them at the fence line had not appeared. They waited anyway. This was, at its most fundamental level, a problem of mathematics. The Davao penal colony, Dapicol, should the prisoners called it, held roughly 2,000 American POWs at that point. The perimeter fence was patrolled by a garrison of Japanese soldiers whose alertness varied dramatically depending on the time of night and how much fermented palm wine they had consumed the previous evening. The jungle beyond the fence was 60 miles of lowland rainforest before anything resembling civilization. Wild boar, malaria, rivers that rose 8 feet in an hour when the rains came. And then somewhere out there, if the intelligence relayed through the camp's secret radio was accurate, Filipino resistance fighters who knew these forests as intimately as Dyess once knew the night sky over Texas. He had grown up under that Texas sky. He had grown up wanting to fly. William Edwin Dyess was born on January 9th, 1916, in Albany, Texas, a town of roughly 4,000 people in Shackelford County, flat and sunbaked, and surrounded by mesquite and live oak and the particular quality of silence that comes from enormous distance between things. His father was a county judge. His mother taught Sunday school. By every account, young Ed Dyess, nobody called him William, was the kind of boy who climbed the water tower and argued later that it had been scientifically necessary. He was coordinated, reckless in the precise way that boys in small Texas towns must be, and possessed of an almost clinical fearlessness that his later commanding officers would describe as either an asset or a liability depending on the hour of the day. He attended Abilene Christian College for 1 year, then transferred to Texas A&M, where he joined the Reserve Officers Training Corps. He was 21 when he applied for Army Air Corps flight training at Randolph Field, San Antonio. The year was 1937. The world had not yet broken open, but the cracks were forming. Japan had invaded China. Germany had reoccupied the Rhineland. Spain was burning. None of that was particularly visible from Randolph Field, where the primary concerns were the angle of approach, the feel of a biplane in a crosswind, and whether the mess hall would serve peach cobbler on Friday. Dyess was a natural. That is the word his flight instructors used. Natural, not in the sense of effortless. He worked harder than almost any cadet in his class, but in the sense of intuitive. He understood the machine in a way that could not be fully taught, the way a gifted musician understands rhythm before anyone explains time signatures to him. He felt the stall before the instruments confirmed it. He read air currents the way a sailor reads water. He graduated near the top of his class and received his pilot's wings in July 1939. 2 years later, he was a first lieutenant commanding the 21st Pursuit Squadron, and on November 20th, 1941, he led his unit off the docks at San Francisco aboard a transport ship bound for the Philippine Islands. He did not know he was flying toward the worst military defeat in American history. Almost nobody did. The Philippines in late 1941 occupied a peculiar position in American strategic thinking, important enough to garrison, too distant to adequately reinforce. General Douglas MacArthur commanded some 80,000 men there, roughly half of them Filipino Army soldiers of variable training and equipment. The American contingent included the Far East Air Force, commanded by General Louis Brereton, which possessed roughly 200 aircraft, of which perhaps 90 were anything resembling combat capable. The P-40 Warhawks assigned to units like Dyess's 21st Pursuit Squadron were not the best fighter in the American inventory, and they were slower than the Japanese Zero at altitude and lacked the Zero's extraordinary maneuverability. What the P-40 had was a sturdy airframe, a reliable Allison engine, and a pilot community that had spent the previous 2 years training for exactly this kind of war. What they did not have was sufficient time. Dyess landed at Manila in late November 1941. He spent the next 2 weeks integrating his squadron with the existing air defenses at Clark Field, the main American airbase on Luzon, and about 50 miles north of Manila. Clark Field in early December 1941 looked like a reasonable military installation. It had a paved runway. It had control facilities. It had dispersed aircraft revetments, except most of the aircraft were not in the revetments. They were lined up on the flight line in neat rows, wingtip to wingtip, in the manner of peacetime airfields everywhere. At 12:22 hours on December 8, 1941, less than 9 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, which reached the Philippines as midnight radio transmissions, Japanese naval bombers appeared over Clark Field in 2 precise formations of 27 aircraft each. They arrived at 23,000 feet and dropped their ordnance with the unhurried accuracy of men who had practiced this specific approach on a model of this specific base. The attack lasted approximately 2 hours. When it ended, the Far East Air Force had ceased to exist as a meaningful fighting force. And 18 of 22 B, 17 at Clark were destroyed on the ground. 53 P-40 burned. The fuel dump went up in a column of black smoke visible 30 miles away. Dyess was in the air when the bombs fell. He had been on a patrol rotation and was returning to base when he saw the smoke. He pushed his P-40 into a dive and arrived over Clark in time to find Japanese Zero fighters strafing the wreckage. He shot down 1, possibly 2. The records do not distinguish cleanly between probable and confirmed kills in the chaos of those first hours. His wingman, a lieutenant from Oklahoma whose name the surviving records do not preserve in connection with this specific engagement, took a 20-millimeter cannon round through his canopy. It was Dyess's introduction to the war. He would fight for the next year. It was not a gentle introduction. What followed on Luzon is one of the more painful chapters in American military history. Not because it was a rout. It was, eventually, but because it was a rout that took 4 months and required extraordinary courage to execute. The remaining American and Filipino forces under MacArthur withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula in early January 1942, executing a fighting retreat that is, by any tactical assessment, among the most skillfully conducted withdrawals in the history of American arms. Had they bought time? They made the Japanese pay for every mile, and in the end, it was not enough, because the fundamental equation was impossible to solve. They were cut off, outnumbered, and the Pacific Fleet that might have resupplied them lay in varying states of wreckage on the floor of Pearl Harbor. Dyess flew out of the forward airstrips on Bataan until there were no more aircraft to fly. When the last P-40 was too badly damaged to repair, he commanded his pilots as ground troops. And they dug trenches. They carried ammunition. Men trained to navigate by instruments and stars now navigated by muzzle flash. The siege of Bataan lasted from January 7th to April 9th, 1942. By the time it ended, the American and Filipino defenders had been on half rations since January, then quarter rations, then whatever they could scavenge from the jungle: wild banana, roots, the occasional monkey, the horses of the 26th Cavalry Regiment, consumed after their riders could no longer feed them. Malaria ran through the defensive lines like a secondary enemy. Dysentery was universal. Dengue fever claimed men who had survived everything the Japanese threw at them. The medical corps performed surgeries without anesthetic, without adequate instruments, frequently without reliable electric light. Major General Edward King Jr. surrendered the Bataan garrison to Japanese General Masaharu Homma on April 9, 1942. 76,000 men laid down their weapons, and it was the largest surrender of American military forces since the Civil War. Dyess was among them. He was 26 years old, 20 pounds underweight, and had not flown in 3 weeks. He was about to discover that the surrender was not, in fact, the worst thing that could happen to him. The Japanese Imperial Army had not planned for 76,000 prisoners. They had planned for perhaps 25,000. Yet the logistics of moving that many men to internment facilities in central Luzon had been calculated on that assumption. When the actual number of surrendering forces turned out to be 3 times the estimate, the calculation did not adjust gracefully. What followed was the Bataan Death March. It covered approximately 65 miles, from the tip of the Bataan Peninsula north to the town of San Fernando, at where the prisoners would be loaded onto railcars for the remainder of the journey to Camp O'Donnell. In isolation, 65 miles is a long walk but not an impossible one. Men in reasonable health, given adequate food and water and rest, cover 65 miles in 3 or 4 days. The men of Bataan were not in reasonable health. They had been on starvation rations for months. Many were acutely ill. All were exhausted in the specific, bone-deep way that comes from sustained malnutrition combined with sustained combat stress. The Japanese guards assigned to the march column were not uniformly cruel. Some were indifferent, some were actively helpful to prisoners who stumbled, and some were not. The men who fell behind were beaten. The men who collapsed were bayoneted or shot. The men who asked for water were occasionally killed for asking. The bodies were left where they fell, on the road shoulders, in the drainage ditches, face down in the dust. When surviving prisoners were later asked to estimate the death toll, their numbers varied between several hundred and several thousand over the course of the march. The historical consensus now places it at somewhere between 600 and 1,100 Americans dead, with Filipino losses considerably higher. Dyess walked every step. He would later describe the march in a memoir dictated after his escape, one of the most important first-person accounts of Japanese POW treatment in the Pacific War. His prose in that account is controlled and specific. He does not indulge in the vocabulary of horror. He reports, men were hit, men fell, men did not get up. He reports these things in the same voice one might use to describe weather conditions. But because the alternative was something no language he possessed could contain. He walked 65 miles in approximately 9 days. Then he arrived at Camp O'Donnell, and the dying continued at a different pace. Camp O'Donnell had been a partially constructed Filipino Army installation before the war. As a POW facility, it had, among its distinguishing features, one water spigot for some 50,000 prisoners, and a medical facility that consisted mainly of a thatched roof and the prayers of the men lying beneath it, a food ration of approximately 200 grams of rice per day per man, and a burial detail that worked without pause for the first 3 months of the camp's operation as a prison. In the first 60 days at O'Donnell, approximately 1,500 Americans died. The Filipino prisoners died at a rate approximately 5 times higher. The graves were shallow because the prisoners digging them lacked the strength for depth, and the Philippine wet season was coming, and everyone knew what water does to shallow graves. Dyess organized. That was his mechanism for survival, and it was not a conscious decision. It was simply what he did, because command was the only language he had been trained in since age 18. He organized the officers of his unit, and he established informal work rotas so that the sickest men could rest while others handled the labor details. He traded information, scraps of news picked up from guards, rumors confirmed or denied by men who had served elsewhere and knew different things. He maintained rank structure not because rank mattered to the Japanese, but because rank mattered to the Americans, because structure is a kind of shelter, because men who understand their place in an organization are less likely to give up, and then men who give up in Camp O'Donnell were men who died. He was transferred, with several hundred other officer prisoners, to Cabanatuan in June 1942. Cabanatuan was marginally better organized and marginally worse in every other sense. The food ration was slightly more consistent. The water was slightly more accessible. The guards were slightly less random in their violence. These were, by that point, the metrics by which Dyess and his fellow prisoners evaluated their circumstances. Slightly, marginally, comparatively. He had been there for 2 months when the word came down through the unofficial information network that moved through the prison camps like water through rock. There were men being selected for transfer to the Davao penal colony in Mindanao. A farm. Actual agricultural labor. More food, possibly. Space to move. The possibility, whispered by men who had heard it from men who had spoken with Filipino guards, and of connection to the resistance networks operating in the Mindanao jungle. Dyess volunteered. It was the best decision he ever made. The Davao penal colony, Dapicol, occupied roughly 3,000 acres of cleared land on the north coast of Mindanao, carved out of the jungle by Filipino convicts who had been its inmates before the war converted it to a different kind of incarceration. The American prisoners worked the fields. They planted rice and cassava and sweet potato. Yet they tended the prison farm's cattle herd. They cleared additional jungle acreage under the direction of Japanese guards who were, by the standards Dyess had come to apply to such measurements, merely brutal rather than sadistic. It was not comfortable. It was not safe. Men died at Dapicol, of disease, of violence, of the accumulated exhaustion of everything that had come before. But it was not Cabanatuan. There was more food, there was more space, and there was the jungle, pressing in on 3 sides, full of shadows and possibility. Dyess made contact with the resistance network in August 1942. He cannot have done this immediately upon arrival. The process required months of careful, terrifying work. He had to identify which Filipino guards could be trusted, which could be bought, which were genuinely sympathetic to the prisoners rather than merely corruptible. He had to establish communication with men outside the wire without being observed establishing it. He had to receive information and pass information through a chain of custody so fragile that a single wrong word spoken to a single wrong person would end with multiple men in the punishment boxes. Small bamboo cages, too short to stand in, too narrow to sit comfortably, exposed to the full sun. By late 1942, he knew 3 things with reasonable confidence. First, that Filipino guerrilla forces under the command of Colonel Wendell Fertig were operating in the Mindanao interior with growing effectiveness. Second, that those forces had radio contact with General MacArthur's command in Australia. Third, that escape, actual, organized, coordinated escape, was not merely theoretically possible. It had been done. Small groups of Filipino convicts had gone over the wire before. The jungle swallowed them, and they disappeared, and then the Japanese response had been measured and largely futile. 10 Americans going over the wire at once would be a different proposition. He began planning. The planning took 4 months. That is not a typo. 4 months of incremental preparation, of information gathering, of contact management, of the kind of operational security that intelligence professionals spend careers learning, and that Dyess and his fellow conspirators had to improvise from nothing. He worked primarily with Lieutenant Colonel Stephen M. Melnick, an Army Coast Artillery officer of formidable analytical intelligence, and Commander Melvin H. McCoy of the United States Navy, who had commanded a minesweeper at Manila Bay and possessed a navigator's instinct for the spatial dimensions of a problem. The 3 of them formed an unofficial planning cell. They rotated their meetings, never the same location twice, never more than 2 of them visible together during working hours. The conversations conducted in the agricultural labor lines were background noise-covered voices. They gathered. The guard rotation schedules, which Dyess memorized by watching the patterns for 16 weeks and noting deviations from the pattern's pattern. The perimeter fence configuration at the northwest corner, where a drainage ditch ran close enough to the wire that a man could approach it and cover. The timing of the searchlight sweeps, which followed a predictable arc except on nights when the generator ran irregularly. The depth and speed of the Tagum River, which ran north of the colony and which any escape party would need to cross before reaching the jungle. They identified their party. 10 men, eventually. Military officers across 3 services. Men who were physically capable enough, barely in some cases, and psychologically stable enough, also barely in some cases, for what was coming. Men with particular skills, Dyess's navigation and flying experience, Melnick's mathematical and engineering knowledge, McCoy's maritime skills, a Navy doctor named Lieutenant Commander Herbert Onimus, whose medical expertise would be essential in the jungle, 2 Army officers whose names were Lieutenant Leo Bolins and Lieutenant Mikhail Dobervich, both survivors of Bataan infantry combat, both men who had been, before the war, at exactly the kind of unremarkable middle American young men the Army manufactured by the hundreds of thousands, and both of whom had been made into something considerably different by the preceding year. They waited for the conditions, a moonless night, a dry weather period when the river would be fordable, a moment in the guard rotation when the northwest corner was in its longest gap between passes. They needed 3 hours of darkness on the far side of the wire. Had perimeter completed his turn at the far perimeter, completed his turn at the far post, and began walking east. He had 3 minutes before the next man in the rotation would reach the drainage ditch corner from the opposite direction. Dyess counted to 10. Then he moved. The wire was a standard military double apron fence, and the kind the Army itself used, which meant Dyess knew its dimensions precisely. He had also spent 3 weeks observing the specific section of fence at the drainage ditch, and he had noted that the ground had settled slightly on the exterior side, creating a gap at the bottom that was not quite the regulation 8 inches, but was perhaps 11. He went through flat on his stomach, turning sideways at the shoulders, the wire catching at his shirt and not at anything worse. Melnick followed, and then McCoy, then the others, one by one, in a silence that was not quite silence, because nothing in the Philippine jungle is ever quiet. There were frogs, always frogs, and insects, and the distant sound of the generator that powered the searchlight, and beneath all of it, the bass note of 10 men trying very hard not to breathe audibly. The Tagum River was 300 meters north. The water was chest deep at the ford point, cold enough to make Dyess's muscles cramp despite the tropical air. And it moved fast, a thick, opaque brown that felt like pushing through something more substantial than water. He had a guide, a Filipino man named Victorio Jumarong, who had been coordinating the escape from outside the fence for the past 2 months, and who now materialized from the darkness on the north bank as Dyess pulled himself out of the river. Jumarong did not speak. He pointed, east-northeast. They walked. They walked for 4 hours in the dark, had through secondary jungle that was not the primary jungle of deeper Mindanao. No 100-foot canopy here, just thick, head-high brush and roots that caught at boots and roots that caught at everything else. The phosphorescent fungus on dead logs provided approximately nothing in terms of navigational assistance. Dyess navigated by compass, by the feel of the slope under his feet, and by the stars when they appeared in gaps between the cloud cover. Yet he had memorized the position of Polaris relative to the magnetic declination for this latitude. He had done this 3 months ago, lying in his bunk at Dapecol, staring at the bamboo ceiling and doing the arithmetic in his head. By dawn on April 5th, they were 12 miles from the colony fence. The jungle was thinning into coconut groves and small banana plantations, which meant human habitation, which was either extremely good or extremely bad, depending entirely on which humans. Jumarong led them into a farmhouse where a Filipino family fed them sweet potato and dried fish and looked at 10 emaciated Americans with the expression of people doing a profoundly dangerous thing because it was the right thing to do. Dyess ate sweet potato. He had not eaten anything in 31 hours. The sweet potato tasted, he would later write, like the best meal he had ever consumed. The next 6 weeks were not a clean escape narrative. They were a complex, dangerous, a logistically improvised odyssey through the Mindanao interior that involved 11 safe houses, 4 river crossings, 3 close encounters with Japanese patrols, and one occasion when Dyess and McCoy spent 22 hours in a dugout fishing boat under a tarpaulin while a Japanese patrol boat circled the same cove 3 times. The guerrilla network that moved them inland was Colonel Fertig's organization, a patchwork of Filipino soldiers, American stragglers who had avoided capture, and civilian resistance members who communicated by runner and by radio, with the increasing frequency as Fertig's operation grew more sophisticated. Fertig himself was a remarkable figure. A mining engineer before the war, he had been a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve and had been swept up in the fall of the Philippines and, rather than surrender, had simply walked into the jungle and started fighting. He had commissioned himself a full general by the time MacArthur's command in Australia became aware of his existence, which created a certain administrative complexity, but by that point Fertig controlled approximately 20,000 armed Filipinos across Mindanao and was operating one of the most effective resistance networks in the Pacific theater. He met Dyess at a guerrilla base camp in the mountains above the Davao Gulf in late April 1943. The meeting, by Melnick's account, that was brief and businesslike. Fertig needed to know that the men he was harboring were who they said they were, that they had not been compromised en route, that their escape had not triggered a response severe enough to endanger his network. Dyess answered his questions. Fertig concluded that the situation was workable. He sent a radio message to MacArthur's headquarters in Australia. 10 American POW officers had escaped from Dapakal and were in his custody. He requested submarine evacuation. The answer came back in 48 hours. Positive. It took 3 more weeks to arrange the actual rendezvous. Submarines could not simply appear at random beaches. The pickup required precise coordination of time and location and authentication signals, all communicated through a radio system that was, by the standards of 1943, crude and intermittent. There was a beach on the western coast of Mindanao, north of the Illana Bay, where the water was deep enough close to shore that a submarine could surface without grounding. There was a date. There was a signal sequence. 1 long flash, 2 short, repeated. On the night of June 7th, 1943, Dyess stood on a dark beach holding a flashlight, looking at the black water, thinking about Texas. He thought about Albany, about his father's courthouse, about the summer sky over the high plains. He thought about these things not because they were sentimental, but because he had learned, over the preceding 14 months, to use the past as ballast. Specific, physical, concrete memories as counterweight to specific, physical, concrete fear. The submarine surfaced at 22:17 hours. It broke the water 150 meters offshore and lay there in the darkness, running lights off, diesel exhaust barely visible against the overcast sky. A rubber raft appeared off its forward deck. My men paddled it ashore. American voices, the first American voices Dyess had heard outside of his fellow prisoners in 14 months, asked for the authentication countersign. Melnick gave it. They paddled out to the submarine in 3 loads. Dyess went in the last load, and when he pulled himself through the forward torpedo room hatch and smelled diesel fuel and machine oil and the specific metallic interior smell of an American warship, yet he sat down on the deck and did not move for approximately 4 minutes. The executive officer, a lieutenant commander from Pennsylvania, brought him a cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt rice substitute served at Dapakal. Dyess drank it without speaking. The submarine, USS Trout, submerged before dawn and began its passage south toward Australia. He arrived in Brisbane in late June 1943, 14 months after the fall of Bataan. He had 12 pounds underweight despite 6 weeks of improved nutrition at guerrilla bases, with a detailed, comprehensive account of the Bataan Death March and Japanese POW treatment that would, within months, constitute one of the most significant intelligence and propaganda documents of the Pacific War. The debrief lasted 11 days. Army intelligence officers, Navy intelligence officers, officers from MacArthur's staff, they came in shifts, asking questions with the methodical intensity of men who understood that the man across the table had seen things that no subsequent source was likely to match for immediacy. Dyess answered everything. He described the Death March. He described Camp O'Donnell. He described Cabanatuan and Dapicol. He provided names of guards, of Japanese officers, of specific incidents that would later be used in war crimes proceedings. He provided estimates of prisoner mortality, and he provided the layout of Dapicol's perimeter defenses and the general disposition of Japanese forces he had observed on Mindanao. And then he asked to go back. This request was not met with enthusiasm by the Army Air Force's bureaucracy, which had just recovered a valuable officer from an enemy prison camp and would have preferred to assign him to a training command in the continental United States, where additional Japanese anti-aircraft fire could not complicate matters. Dyess argued, yet he pointed out that he was a qualified P-40 pilot with extensive combat experience over Luzon, that the P-38 Lightning now entering service in the Pacific required pilots who understood the specific challenges of Pacific aerial combat, and that his knowledge of Japanese tactics and Japanese psychology was, if anything, enhanced by the preceding 14 months. He was persuasive. He was also, by all accounts, immovable on the subject. In August 1943, Major William Edwin Dyess received command of the 475th Fighter Group's 433rd Fighter Squadron, based at Dobodura, New Guinea. He was flying P-38s. The P-38 Lightning was not the aircraft Dyess had flown over Bataan. The difference between a P-40 Warhawk and a P-38 Lightning is roughly analogous to the difference between a good horse and a locomotive. Both get you there, but the experience is entirely dissimilar. The P-38 was a twin-engine, twin-boom design of deliberate eccentricity, powered by two Allison Phi 1710 engines, producing a combined 2,600 horsepower, capable of 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, armed with 4.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns and a single 20mm Hispano cannon, firing from the aircraft's nose. It had a range with external tanks of approximately 2,200 miles, a figure that mattered enormously in the Pacific, much where the distance between the nearest friendly airfield and the nearest important Japanese target was typically measured in hundreds of miles of open ocean. Dyess transitioned to the aircraft at a training facility in Australia in 4 weeks. His conversion performance was evaluated by a Czech pilot who had not been told the new pilot's background, and the Czech pilot noted in his assessment, natural precision in formation flying, aggressive on gunnery, no hesitation on instruments. An instrument flying suggests someone who has spent significant time in underpowered aircraft in poor conditions. This was, as assessments go, fairly accurate. He flew his first combat mission in a P-38 on September 3, 1943. His squadron was tasked with escorting a formation of B-25 Mitchell medium bombers attacking Japanese shipping and installations at Wewak on the northern New Guinea coast. Wewak was, at that point, the main Japanese airbase on New Guinea, a complex of 4 airfields with approximately 300 aircraft of various types, heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns and the remnants of air groups that had been bleeding away since the Guadalcanal campaign, but remained capable of mounting serious resistance. The mission launched at 0600 hours from Dobodura. 48 P-38s, 16 B-25s, 465 miles to target, weather building on the right flank of the formation from an unstable air mass over the Bismarck Sea. Dyess flew in the lead element of the top cover flight, which put him at 22,000 feet directly above the bombers. He had his radio set to the squadron frequency, and the bomber frequency simultaneously, which gave him the dual-channel awareness of the tactical situation that he had learned was essential in the first 5 minutes of a combat engagement. The 5 minutes when everything happened too fast for deliberate decisions. And the difference between a pilot who survived and a pilot who did not was the quality of the picture he had built before the shooting started. Japanese fighters rose from Wewak at 0847 hours. They were Zeros and Ki 43 Hayabusas, was climbing in 2 distinct formations from 2 of the 4 airfields, which meant the fighter controller on the ground had identified the bomber's approach vector and was positioning a crossing attack rather than a head-on intercept. Dyess saw this before the warning calls started. He saw it because he had spent 2 years watching Japanese fighters work, and he understood their tactical preferences in the particular, textured way that comes from observing an enemy up close rather than reading about them in intelligence summaries. He keyed the radio. Red flight, break right on my mark. Target the lower formation. 3, 2, 1, mark. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes in which the sky above Wewak became a 3-dimensional arena of crossing gun runs, defensive breaks, climbing maneuvers, and the occasional bright orange flash that meant a fuel tank had found a tracer. Dyess's gun camera later showed 4 firing passes, 3 of which were confirmed hits, one of which, a high-deflection shot from 700 feet, produced a Japanese Ki 43 that shed its right wing and entered a vertical dive from which it did not recover. His 3rd confirmed aerial kill of the war, his first in a P-38. He landed at Dobadura at 12:38 hours, shut down his engines, and climbed down from the cockpit in the specific way that pilots climb down when their legs are slightly unreliable, and they would prefer that nobody notice. The crew chief, a technical sergeant from Missouri, looked at the aircraft's nose and said something about the state of the gun muzzles. Dyess said that the gun muzzles had been productive, which was the kind of thing he said. He ate lunch. Then he went to the debriefing. Then he started planning the next mission. Said this is what command looks like from the outside. It looks like paperwork and briefings, and the management of schedules, and the maintenance of equipment, and the 1,000 quotidian tasks that fill the hours between the moments that history records. It looks like walking the flight line at 0500 hours to check on the mechanics who have been working through the night on an engine that developed a hydraulic leak on the afternoon mission. Yet it looks like sitting with a 22-year-old pilot from Ohio who has just had his first man die in front of him, a wingman taken by a Zero that came from the sun, the oldest trick and still effective, and not saying anything particularly useful, but being present in a way that matters anyway. From the inside, command looks like the awareness of an equation that never quite resolves. Dyess commanded 42 pilots in the 433rd. Each of those pilots was a specific person with specific capabilities and specific limitations, and his knowledge of those specifics, who could be counted on to hold formation in poor visibility, who was outstanding in a turning fight, but lost situational awareness under heavy fire, who made good decisions in the first 30 seconds of an engagement and poor ones in the following 60, was the fundamental instrument he navigated by. He flew with different elements of his squadron in a deliberate rotation, not because he needed the missions, but because he needed to see his pilots work, to update his model of their capabilities, to know before the critical moment which man he could assign to the most difficult position. This was, in its essence, the same process he had used at Camp O'Donnell, organizing the survivors by capability and matching tasks to men. The tools were different, the stakes were the same. By October 1943, and the 433rd had flown 68 combat missions, destroyed 41 confirmed enemy aircraft in the air, and an estimated 70 on the ground, and lost 9 pilots. Dyess had written 9 letters to families in American cities explaining that their son, or their husband, or their brother had died in the service of his country. He wrote each letter in his own hand, not in the mandatory formula language provided by the Adjutant General's office, because the mandatory formula language was insufficient. He wrote what he knew about each man specifically. He wrote about what they had done. He was preparing in early November 1943 to take the 433rd on an ambitious sweep of the Japanese airfields at Hollandia, a mission that, if successful, would effectively strip the Japanese air umbrella from the western New Guinea coast and accelerate MacArthur's campaign timeline by months. The mission was his idea. He had proposed it through channels and argued its merits with the group commander and the 5th Air Force staff, and obtained authorization for a long-range strike using the P-38's full-range capability with external tanks. He was also, simultaneously, under orders to return to the United States. MacArthur's headquarters had been sitting on a decision about Dyess since his arrival in theater. The information he carried, the eyewitness account of the Death March, and the detailed intelligence on Japanese POW practices, was considered too valuable and too potentially sensitive for a man who flew combat missions over Japanese defended territory. If Dyess was shot down and captured again, the Japanese would learn that their treatment of prisoners had been systematically documented, which might trigger consequences for prisoners still held. If he was killed, his testimony died with him. The War Department, at which had been negotiating with MacArthur's command about when and how to release the Death March information to the American public, wanted Dyess back in the continental United States, where he could participate in that process under controlled conditions. The orders had been issued in September. Dyess had not exactly refused them. He had asked for additional time to prepare his squadron for the Hollandia mission. He had then prepared the Hollandia mission plan in sufficiently thorough detail that requesting additional time to execute it was not unreasonable. He was, by every account, aware that he was maneuvering. He did not have infinite time to maneuver. In late November, the orders were reiterated with the particular emphasis that indicates an order is not going to be reiterated again. Major William Edwin Dyess departed New Guinea for the United States in late November 1943. He had 45 days before his scheduled public affairs appearances in Washington. He requested assignment to a transition training facility in California, arguing that he needed to maintain currency on the P-38 while stateside. This was approved. The facility was at Lockheed Air Terminal in Burbank, California, which was also where the P-38 was manufactured, and where Lockheed test pilots flew new aircraft off the production line and into the acceptance trials that cleared them for delivery to the military. Dyess arrived at Burbank on December 20th, 1943. He was 27 years old. 2 days later, on the morning of December 22nd, 1943, he climbed into a P-38J fresh off the Lockheed production line. The aircraft, tail number 42-67717, had been delivered from the factory floor 2 days prior and required a brief acceptance check flight before it would be cleared for delivery to a combat unit. The check was routine. The P-38J was the latest variant of the Lightning, upgraded from the earlier models with improved turbo supercharger intercoolers that solved a persistent engine cooling problem and enhanced high-altitude performance. It was, in the estimation of every test pilot who had flown it, at a better aircraft than the P-38H Dyess had been flying over New Guinea. The weather over Burbank on December 22nd was overcast at 4,000 feet, clearing to the north, winds from the northwest at 12 knots. Standard California winter weather, nothing that would have given a combat pilot any hesitation. Dyess took off at 11:09 hours. What happened in the next few minutes is not fully reconstructed by the accident investigation. Because the P-38J was over a residential area when something went wrong, the exact nature of the malfunction remains a matter of some technical dispute among the investigators who worked the case. What the investigation established, at some point during the flight, at low altitude over the Hancock Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, the aircraft entered a descent that did not recover. The impact occurred at 11:14 hours. William Edwin Dyess was killed on impact. He was 27 years old and 4 months and 12 days removed from the prison camp where he had survived things that should have killed him. He had written 42 letters to the families of men who died under his command. He had survived the Bataan Death March. He had survived Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan and Dapicol. He had survived 11 days in the Mindanao jungle. He had survived being evacuated by submarine through waters that Japanese destroyers patrolled. He had survived 43 combat missions in 2 different aircraft types against an enemy who had been trying, with professional thoroughness, to kill him since December 8, 1941. He had not survived a production test flight over Burbank. The Army released the news of his death on December 23, 1943. The circumstances were briefly confused in the public reporting. Several newspapers initially indicated he had died in combat, which was not precisely accurate, but was perhaps understandable given the context of the preceding 2 years. The correction ran in smaller type the following day. The War Department's release of the Bataan Death March testimony, which Dyess and Melnick and McCoy had provided in the Brisbane Debriefs, came on January 28, 1944, 5 weeks after his death. The release was timed deliberately, partly to coincide with the anniversary of the fall of Bataan, and partly because the censorship board that had been sitting on the material since mid-1943 had concluded that the propaganda value now outweighed the risks. The Dyess account, as it came to be known, appeared first in the Chicago Tribune and was syndicated across the American press. It described, in Dyess's specific, unornamented language, exactly what the Bataan Death March had been. It described the bayoneting of men who fell, and it described the denial of water. It described the killing of prisoners for the entertainment or convenience of their guards. The American public had not known the full dimensions of this. They had suspected. They had heard rumors. But the specific, sourced first-person account of an officer who had walked every step and then escaped to testify, that was something different from rumor. The response was not fully measurable in historical records, but it was visible in recruiting numbers, and in bond drive returns, in the specific quality of fury that entered the American public's relationship with the Pacific War in early 1944. It was visible in the editorial pages of newspapers in cities from Boston to Los Angeles that were, for once, not arguing about strategy or priorities, but were simply expressing the particular American species of cold rage that sets in when something unacceptable has been done to someone who did not deserve it. Dyess had known, when he agreed to the debriefs, that this was what the information was for. He had understood the strategic utility of what he was carrying out of Debrief. He had cooperated fully and without evident bitterness, because he understood that the most useful thing he could do for the men still in Japanese camps was ensure that the world knew what was being done to them. He did not live to see the publication. The question of legacy, what a man leaves behind, at what changes because he existed, is always more complicated than the clean version that memorial plaques and dedications tend to offer. William Dyess was not a general. He commanded a squadron, not a campaign. He developed no tactical doctrine that entered the training manuals. He did not make decisions that turned the course of the Pacific War on a strategic level. What he did was more particular than that, and in some ways more durable. His testimony about the Death March created a specific, documented record of Japanese atrocities against prisoners of war at a time when the American public's understanding of that war was incomplete in ways that mattered for the conduct of the war itself. The Dyess account, and the similar accounts provided by Melnick and McCoy in their own memoirs, established an evidentiary foundation that contributed directly to the war crimes proceedings after Japan's surrender. Proceedings in which General Masaharu Hama, the Japanese commander at Bataan, was found responsible for the conditions of the Death March and executed in 1946. Hama had not ordered the Death March in the specific sense of issuing written directives for prisoner mistreatment. What he had done was create the conditions: inadequate supply, inadequate medical support, guards selected from garrison units rather than combat units, an organizational culture that regarded the care of prisoners as a low priority, that made atrocity inevitable rather than exceptional. At the war crimes tribunals made this distinction explicitly, drawing on the testimony of survivors and the documentary record to establish command responsibility as a legal concept applicable to conditions as well as orders. This concept, command responsibility for foreseeable consequences of command decisions, rather than only responsibility for specific directives, is not a minor contribution to the law of war. It is, in fact, and one of the more significant legal developments to emerge from the Pacific War's prisoner of war proceedings, and it is traceable, in part, to the quality of the evidentiary record that men like Dyess provided. His escape from Dapicol had an additional strategic effect that is less often remarked. The 10 escapees carried out of Mindanao not only their personal testimonies, but detailed intelligence on the Japanese garrison of Dapicol, the surrounding area, and in the state of the guerrilla network operating in Mindanao's interior. This intelligence supported MacArthur's planning for the eventual liberation of the Philippines. Colonel Fertig's network, which had made the escape possible, and which the Brisbane headquarters now had direct, confirmed intelligence on, received increased support, supplies, communications equipment, additional personnel, in the months following the Dyess Group's evacuation. Fertig's forces, which numbered roughly 20,000 at the time of the liberation, played a significant role in the Mindanao campaign of 1945. None of this was Dyess's doing in the sense of his having planned or directed it. It was rather the downstream consequence of his having survived, escaped, and reported accurately, which is, in the end, exactly what an officer is supposed to do. Albany, Texas, dedicated a memorial to him. The Army Air Forces named a training field in his honor, Dyess Army Airfield, now Dyess Air Force Base, west of Abilene, Texas, which continues to operate as an active installation and serves as the home of the 7th Bomb Wing flying B-1B Lancers. The man who grew up under the big sky of West Texas and learned to fly in its flat, uncomplicated air is remembered in the region he came from as something close to a native saint. His book, The Dyess Story, was published posthumously in 1944, compiled from his dictated debriefs and edited for public consumption. It sold extensively. It has been out of print for most of the period since. The way books tend to become out of print, when the war they document passes from immediate to historical memory, but it has been reproduced in scholarly editions and remains, for historians of the Pacific War's prisoner experience, a primary source of considerable precision. His grave is in Albany, Texas. The sky over Albany is, on most days, and exactly what it was when he was young.